Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. It is time to take some of your questions, and our first one this week comes from Twitter, and it's from Impala, who says, why is the Liberal government not more proactive in protecting women's rights in provinces where Conservative governments are using funding decisions to essentially prohibit abortions? Trudeau promised to address this. When's that happening? This is part of the issue with the complexity of federal-provincial relations when it comes to healthcare. The government has a certain number of levers it can use, largely around funding, and that's probably what it's going to come down to. I think that, there was largely the case we're dealing with is in New Brunswick right now, and the one private clinic that was providing this kind of care, as well as some other LGBT-related care as well. So what is likely to happen is now that we have a new health minister in place, she is likely going to be calling her provincial counterpart, and they need to probably dance around this gingerly to begin with before they start escalating the threats. But knowing this government and its feminist agenda, this will be something that they will certainly be putting the province basically on notice. I don't know if I have a timeline for that, but you can imagine that there are calls being made pretty much right now. And we will see how quickly the province responds before they start losing on other federal funds that they are waiting for. Our next question is from Geeta V, who asks, is there a center-leaning wing within the Conservative Party? Does it have any influence over policy? Short answer is yes and yes, but the broader answer is a little more complicated and nuanced. The more center-leaning Conservatives, or the Red Tories as they are more colloquially known, tend to reside largely in areas of Ontario and in Atlantic Canada. They're a much more, progressive, conservative wing of the party that, what used to be the PCs before the merger with the Reform/Alliance Party. And that's kind of where their geographic concentration is. Where they have influence on policy tends to be on who they can mobilize at policy conventions. And that may be a big factor coming up in the leadership review that will be happening in April. Why? Because it's taking place in Toronto, which means it will be much more difficult for the more harder right Conservatives in Alberta and Saskatchewan to make the trek out to Toronto to this convention. So that may mean that the ability to mobilize more delegates for this particular convention will have an impact on policy discussion and whether or not Andrew Scheer survives that leadership review. So that's kind of the dynamic at play. In terms of names within that kind of Red Tory wing, the most prominent is probably Michael Chong. He came in 5th in the previous leadership convention. Unfortunately, because he would talk about things like carbon pricing as being actually conservative ideas because they deal with, market forces, he was derided as a liberal by elements of the party. So there is, a bit of, there is tension and hostility there. It's going to depend on how much the party wants to try and drag itself into the modern era. This is something that's playing out right now with the party in terms of LGBT rights. There was just a piece in the Globe and Mail this past week where two fairly prominent voices for the party who are both LGBT basically came out and said, if you want to win urban seats in order to get a majority government in the future, we're going to have to deal with this head on, and we're going to have to stop pussyfooting around, these basic rights. So we'll see if there is a receptive audience for that within the party membership. We'll find that out in the lead up to April, and we'll kind of go from there. Only other thing I would add is people keep bandying Peter MacKay's name around as someone who might be that kind of red Tory savior. I am not one of those people. Peter MacKay may have been the last leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, but when he was a member of Stephen Harper's cabinet, he did not serve as a moderating influence on any of the kind of policies that were being debated, whether it was when they attempted to reopen the question of same-sex marriage, or when it was on trans rights or anything like that. MacKay was not one of the red Tories who stood up and voted against the party on any of these measures. Those were people like James Moore and Gerald Keddy and Lisa Raitt, and those are all voices who are not in the party anymore. So don't count on Peter MacKay. Our last question this week comes from Patricia, also via Twitter, who asks, what does a resurgent bloc mean for SNC-Lavalin and Quebec politics in general? This is something that we will likely hear about once Parliament is back in session, probably not till the committees are reconstituted in the new year. But there are grumblings, particularly from Conservatives, that they want to try and reopen the SNC issue again. The dynamic there with the Bloc is that because the Bloc now has basically a swing vote on most of those committees, they are not going to be interested in reopening any investigations. Quebec was very pro-Trudeau trying to, save the company, in the whatever ham-fisted way he was attempting to do so, because it's a homegrown company for them, and they put a bunch of, I will say national pride in it, but that being the case, I don't think that's going to, or that dynamic is going to really let Parliament reopen this issue or relitigate it in any particular way. There may be another attempt or two in the Senate to try and get answers. I know there was one senator who wanted to try and find, who's been talking about it in any case. I don't think that's going to necessarily go anywhere, because I think there's enough independent senators who are skittish about about this sounding too partisan, and like they're trying to reopen some kind of a witch hunt or something like that. So I don't expect that to go anywhere in the Senate either. So that's kind of where that's at. In terms of the broader Quebec politics question, I think what we've seen to date is that the Bloc have started seeing themselves less as separatists and more as the federal extension of the current provincial government, which is, more nationalist than anything. I know the Conservatives thought that the party was right-leaning enough that they could try and capitalize on their votes, and the analyses that we have seen have pretty much shown that no, those votes didn't go to Conservatives, they went to Bloc. So I think that's likely what that repercussion is going to be on a federal level. It's going to be a lot of, Yves-François Blanchet parroting whatever François Legault will pronounce, and Blanchet standing up in the House of Commons and saying, Legault says this, so therefore we must do this. I think, this is not uncommon for the Bloc, particularly on what I like to think of as the weekly time slot in the Quebec National Assembly for unanimous motions against something that the federal government is doing. And the Bloc typically like to stand up and demand action on that unanimous motion, and we will just see a much more formalized, ritualized version of this with the Bloc in a more resurgent capacity. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.